Greetings, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I will continue this lecture somewhat where we left off in the last lecture. I had been talking about a process that Quiñones Rosado calls consciousness in action. Others call Conscientización. It is a process of developing a critical awareness of the world and taking action with others to change oppressive social structures. So today is part 2 of thinking about this process out of 3 parts, at least in this course. And today we focus in on counterspaces and coalitions using the articles, the Case and Hunter article, and then the chapter, which is a speech from Bernice Johnson Regan. And we'll weave these together and try to think through what, at face value might seem somewhat contradictory. Can counterspaces, is that what's being argued for? Or coalitions, is that what's being argued for? And actually what we're going to come to is a both and position, not either or, but both and. So let's get right into it. And I'm going to define counterspaces to start this off using Case and Hunter. They talk about counterspaces being these settings or these sites where deficit or deficient notions of people of color can be challenged and where a positive climate can be established and maintained. So this definition actually is based on Daniel Solorzano's work. So I would extend it to any group of people who faces oppression. So it can be a group of people of color. It can be based on gender. It could be women or trans people, non-binary folks could make up a counter space. It could be queer folks. It could be immigrants. Any group that faces oppression can create a counter space. And Case and Hunter talk about these as being sites of radical possibility. This meaning radical in the sense, 2 senses here. One, that things can happen in counter spaces that are totally unanticipated. Things can grow that people couldn't have predicted at the beginning. People's wildest dreams could come true, and the things that we can't even think about can happen through counter spaces. Johnson Regan talks about this as well. She talks about the civil rights movement creating basically counter spaces, and these counter spaces growing, and Black counter spaces inspiring counter spaces for other movements, for LGBTQAI movements, women's movements, she called it Chicano movements. So certainly the Chicano power movement, but more broadly Latinx power, American Indian movement. And that she's arguing it starts with the organizing of Black people in counter spaces. And so that also goes to the second meaning of radical, meaning structural change, deeper changes going to the roots. And this can very much start when counter spaces are created. And interestingly, counter spaces can range from, they're on a spectrum of potentially very formal and institutional, and then they can go all the way to very informal and very hidden from the dominant eye. And so you might have these formal counter spaces. A good example of that would be the resource centers on campus, Ethnic Resource Center, the Queer Cantu Center, the Women's Center. Those are all formal institutional counter spaces. And then there are others that proliferate in people's houses or friend groups, or sometimes just when 2 people meet of a same positionality and talk critically and create a counter space. sort of like that idea of everyday form of resistance. The very informal counterspaces could be seen as an everyday form of resistance. And so part of what's happening here in a counterspace is this aspect of conscientization that is about developing resilience and developing resistance to oppression. And the authors here use the language adaptive response. So they say an adaptive response for a person who's experiencing oppression is the response is this process promotes well-being in response to the psychological experience of oppression through ongoing individual, attitudinal, cognitive, and behavioral and collective social processes and actions responses. So counterspaces create the possibility for adaptive responses. And adaptive here, I don't love that word here because it's a little bit vague. Does it mean adapting to oppression, or does it mean adaptive, meaning changing, flexible? And it is that second one where someone is flexible and resilient and resistant, that type of adaptivity, rather than adapting to oppression and assimilating to it. It's not that at all. So resilience and resistance. So basically adaptive responses are a part of conscientization and a part of counterspaces, or counterspaces can create the conditions for the adaptive response. Let's look in a little bit closer towards the psychology of adaptive responses. So oppression is a threat to one's humanity and dignity. So it's a threat, a physical threat to one's well-being, and it's a threat to one's psychology, one's sense of self. If we think of oppression as creating these dynamics of superiority and inferiority, it's a threat around the messaging that marginalized people, oppressed people hear about themselves that circulate in the dominant culture. So an adaptive response has to have two things going for it. The first is self-protection. So in order to survive this threat, one has to be protected. One has to have a degree of not being harmed or injured by this, having a shield to it, having a buffer to it. And, they're beyond, healing and developing critical consciousness, all very important, but certainly like the violence, the direct violence, and the structural violence, there has to be protections from that. And so we'll see counterspaces can create that. And then the second part of it is self-enhancement. And this is not in the individualistic sense of the word self-enhancement. This is a developing of self-worth, self-esteem, and basically a dignity for oneself. And that includes the groups that one's a part of. So whereas oppression is the denigration of one's group, the self-enhancement is the person and the groups they are a part of. And again, counterspaces are able to do both of these things. And so therefore, counterspaces help or assist the psychology of an adaptive response, which again is connected to resilience and resistance to oppression. So how do counterspaces do that? How do counterspaces facilitate adaptive responses? There are three main ways that they do that, and these are called challenging processes. So by that terminology, the authors mean that these challenge oppression. So challenging the oppression processes of counterspaces. So the first aspect that the authors zero in on is narrative identity work. And this is very much around self enhancement aspects. So narrative identity work is about the stories that we tell about ourselves. And stories are a deep, deep part of our psychology. We are our stories. And that's how we think of ourselves, through our stories of ourselves. And it's how we communicate who we are to other people. So this narrative identity work is very, very important. And so it starts off from the oppressive to the liberatory. And what I mean by that is that identity work is indicating or identifying stories that people tell about themselves that are oppressive, and then recognize the ways in which those stories are the dominant culture's work, not some natural story or some inherent story, but it's the sort of the abusive aspects of the dominant culture creating stories, and then promoting the internalization of that story. So again, back to Quiñones Rosado, this idea of perceiving and recognizing. So perceiving the stories, that's telling stories, and then sort of finding the ways that dominant society has promoted these stories, and then slowly working together to promote liberatory stories. So stories about resistance. In the social biography, we had you write aspects of getting to this part of your life. And there are, in those stories, we saw some oppressive narratives, and we saw some liberatory narratives. And so Counterspace would work with the liberatory narratives that people already bring to the space, but then also bring new liberatory narratives. For example, if people have never heard about the resistance, like of people like Bernice Johnson Reagan, we can tell stories about her wonderful work, and the ways that her story is connected to Black liberation and the liberation of all people. And so that's a story that people can see themselves in and develop their own liberatory narratives. Okay, also what's happening in Counterspaces are acts of resistance. And you've come across this in our class through everyday acts of resistance. And so that is a part of what's meant here. And it's also collectivizing these everyday acts of resistance. So, resistance comes in so many forms. The authors talk about songwriting, artwork, also other forms of resistance, like, how people might challenge oppression in their everyday lives, or things like, stealing from stores, like we talked about in the Rios article. That's developed in all these forms of resistance are brought out and discussed and talked about. And how do people survive colonization and oppression? How do people, share space? So counter spaces, as we talked about early on, are made up of people who are all facing the same type of oppression. So there's a possibility for vulnerability and empathy and shared ideas. Counter spaces, they're not automatic. They have to be developed trust. And, just because someone shares the same identity as you doesn't mean they're a person who you're going to connect with. So counter spaces are they're developed over time as well. And over time, collective forms of resistance develop too, where people come together and talk about, hey, maybe we want to do a collective artwork, a mural somewhere, or maybe we want to lead a movement. Maybe we want to change the way that people vote in Georgia and defeat Trump in Georgia. So actually, a lot of the organizing came out of counter spaces, as an example. And direct relational transactions occur. So this is relationships, basically, the idea of relationships building, what I already alluded to. People build trust, friendship, connection, love, a deep sense of solidarity with one another, and basically community building. And so counter spaces can can be lifelong, and really powerful. And so this is the article, and one more quote from this article in this slide. Towards the end of the article, they talk about counterspaces can be thought of as revolutionary settings embedded within larger settings and contexts. So counterspaces are exist within within a larger ecology of larger institutions. So there are, for example, I could give the example, the resource centers on campus are within the larger setting of the campus, the larger setting of society. And then there are counter spaces within those resource centers of people. And I don't think I get too far into it here, but a thought to think about is that they bring up at the end of the article is, sometimes counter spaces work, and there's always difference within a counter space. There's never, a monolith of identity, within, for example, in terms of the Bernice Johnson Regan, that there are Black counter spaces, but there are, different gender and sexual and orientation, different class backgrounds to people coming to those counter spaces. The commonality is having a Black identity, but that doesn't automatically mean people have the same experiences. And sometimes those counter spaces fall apart, and smaller counter spaces need to exist. For example, Black women may be the right type of counter space. So Bernice Johnson Regan basically does talk about this, and she says counter spaces embedded within larger settings, in her language, would be homes within coalitions. And so let's talk a little bit about coalitions and this idea. So in her article, her language is a home, and what she means is homes that are created, not necessarily the home you came from, but something like a chosen home, where you come together with people who you really trust and have built revolutionary space with. And then she says that's basically really important, and that's given the world a lot, but it can't end there. And coalitions are also something that we need to think about as well. So this is Bernice Johnson Regan. She's amazing activist. She's a luminary, someone that in our studies of oppression and liberation, it's really important to know her work. She's an activist, and she's a singer, songwriter, a professor, and a curator of museums at the Smithsonian Institute. So yeah, a longtime activist in the civil rights struggle, and coming out of Georgia, Albany, Georgia, in the 60s and 70s. Actually a key person within the civil rights movements, and then a prolific singer and songwriter. So she would bring music to a lot of the events, the big events and marches, and really transform the experience, music being such an important aspect of activism. And so she came out of SNCC. She was a SNCC freedom singer. SNCC stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a really important group in the 60s in terms of the civil rights movement. Basically organized Mississippi Freedom Schools, Mississippi Freedom Summer in '64, which had a profound effect on the fight for civil rights. They basically also, they're young activists and inspired the Black Panthers, and John Lewis, who died this year, legendary congressman, was a SNCC activist. So that's where Bernice Johnson Regan got her start. And she's also a singer in this group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, and I'm going to play a song from them, Ella's Song, which is about Ella Baker, also a really important activist in the civil rights movement and beyond. And this is a song about basically liberation comes when people care as much about Black babies as they do white babies. And so it's a song basically that was predicting, or has not the same language, but basically around Black Lives Matter. So I'll play a few minutes of the song.
You believe in freedom, cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom, cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We who believe in freedom, cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. Do you believe in freedom cannot rest? Sing it with me if you like it. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. Cause to me, young people come first. They have the courage when we fail. And if I can shed some light, I say, carry us through the gales. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Let me talking to you. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until and struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. No man's word. We believe in freedom cannot rest. And we talking to you. We believe in freedom cannot rest until not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I need to be one in the number rising and against tyranny. We believe in freedom and not rest. Oh, we believe in freedom and not rest until it And
That's a really good reminder of there is no liberation without music, that music is a key part of any social justice struggle, and also a great reminder that liberation is a process that is about constant struggle, and those who are fighting for liberation can't rest until it comes. And that also means fighting for everyone's liberation. And that also means engaging in coalitions, which are very exhausting and challenging, but necessary for liberation. So coalition work is not work done in your home. Coalition work is done in the streets, and it is some of the most dangerous work you can do. And you shouldn't look for comfort. So she's saying in this article, people think that you can change the world by creating a home for everyone. And she's also basically saying, no, that won't work. You can't create a home for everyone. This idea of unity that we're hearing right now is not something that can actually exist, not under capitalism, not under the world that we currently live in, because certain groups will take over that home, like white women within feminist movements have done, white cis women have done. And they say this is a movement for everyone, but then center white cis issues. So that's a big critique of Bernice Johnson Regan here, saying, no, that's not a home. That's actually a coalition space, and coalition spaces are really dangerous. So I'll get to that point in a second that I'm thinking about here. So coalitions are not safe spaces. They are not, a coalition of different groups coming together. They're dangerous. They're people coming from different places, making different assumptions about the work, having different needs. And in the society that we live in, there's a lot of cutthroat attitudes. So it's really important to understand when spaces are coalitions, and most spaces, the vast majority of spaces are coalitional spaces, not homes. Homes are very special spaces. Homes are counter spaces that are, that encourage adaptive responses. Coalitions are not those things. And so classrooms are coalitional spaces, as we've already talked about in this class, the pedagogy of risk. When people are coming from different racial backgrounds, gender identities, class backgrounds, geographical, political backgrounds, as classrooms are, those are coalitional spaces. So this is just more emphasis that safe spaces in quotation marks, don't really exist. And even in a counter space, it's not truly a safe space. It's what would be called a safer space. And that's good to have some spaces that are safer for that self-protection, but there's no space that's truly a safe space. Counterspaces, coalitions, and survival. So this is some quotes from the article that talk about Bernice Johnson Regan as a Black woman, talking about the challenges of survival, and the ways in which Black women have needed to toggle between home spaces and coalitions in order to survive. Oppressed groups must go back and forth between creating homes, creating counter spaces, but then also occasionally engaging in coalitions. So there's no chance you can survive by staying in the barred room. So here early in the article, she's saying, home's great, home's nurturing, it's like a womb space, but you can't survive in it. A counter space, the home space, it can't be the only space that a person has in their life. And yeah, I'll come back to that idea. But on the other hand, coalitions can kill people. So it's not like you leave the counter space and somehow engaging in coalitions are any more safe. Coalitions, again, are dangerous places. People can get really hurt, abused, and actually die in coalitional spaces. The ways that people who have more power within a coalition can leave those more vulnerable out in the danger. And that's unfortunately too often the cases within coalitions. Those with privilege think it's a home space, think it's wonderful for everyone, and then leave, and then people who are more vulnerable suffer. It only matters if you can make a commitment to be around for another 50 years. So in spite of all this, Bernice Johnson Reagan is saying that we need people to not give up. So you can't rest until everyone's free. Like this challenge of working in home spaces, working in coalitions, it's going to be tough, but it's important that people try to commit to working through this. And so the only way to do this is the wars against oppression. They must be waged guerrilla warfare style. This is a really interesting point, and I think one that is certainly borne out through history, that oppressed groups need to be strategic. And fighting a war, I talked a little bit about this in the Everyday Forms of Resistance, that wars of maneuvering these big battles of oppressed groups can't fight those battles and survive. They have to be guerrilla warfare style. So that means being strategic with coalitions, entering in coalitions when they work, but not staying around too long, not letting those who have privilege burn them. I'm thinking here in terms of the election in which Biden was elected by a coalition of different groups. The very minute he gets elected, centrist liberals start talking about those on the left, marginalized people, basically, the most marginalized, as being too radical with their socialist defund the police rhetoric. So already the coalition is falling apart. The centrist liberals will then blame those on the left for fracturing the coalition. However, historically, that's not borne out. It was centrist making these demands on the left. Moreover, they're not actually borne out by empirical data. There's no data that was actually the case, that those narratives hurt any races. That would take a lot of study. That would take a few weeks or months of study to actually make that assessment. Those on the left, those who are marginalized, oppressed, have to be strategic and know that that's going to happen. This has happened before, and new coalitions need to form. New coalitions that pressure Biden, while at the same time fighting the dangers on the right as well. So it's challenging work, but having home spaces again and having nurturing spaces, counter spaces, is really important for long-term survival. Summary: counter spaces, or chosen homes, are very important sites of healing, survival, and conscientization. These spaces are not to be given up. And the dominant society will say counter spaces are not acceptable. They'll say, why are all these Black people meeting? Isn't that segregation? Those type of narratives. No, this Counterspace article says, these spaces are super important, and get out of here with that dominant rhetoric. So these spaces are not to be given up. But from there, groups can work in coalition, and coalitions are stronger when people have strong counter spaces that people can return to and act out of. Finally, both should exist only as long as they are working. So I talked about coalitions breaking apart, that's fine when coalitions break apart. Those are by definition very fragile spaces and volatile spaces. So if a coalition breaks apart, that's good. And marginalized groups should get out of there fast and not get burned by groups who have more power. And counter spaces can also fall apart too. And that's okay too. If there's oppression going on within a counter space, sometimes it can be addressed through dialogue, but sometimes it can't. And sometimes new counter spaces need to form as well. And that's that flexibility, that adaptability, that's ultimately important as well. Okay, that's all I have for this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention, and take good care.